So today I'm going to be talking about fire research at Umfolozi and its relationship with fire management. This is the result of lots of work of many people, and I hope I'm going to demonstrate that in the talk. So I don't usually say this, everyone knows that grassland fires and savanna fires are, mostly it's the grass field that's burning, but they can still be pretty intense. And that really, only for half of the year is the fuel really flammable and able to burn. So for a lot of the time, you don't get much fire. So you get this inverse relationship between rainfall and fire. So when we're talking about fire, this is the type of fires we're talking about. But within grassy systems, you get a huge amount, like range in the degree to which fire is an important consumer. And these are data from the whole of Africa that I pulled together across a rainfall gradient. Fire increases from low rainfall up to a sort of maximum, and then it decreases again, basically because you're getting less grassy systems. But I just wanted to put it in here to show that the exciting thing about Umfolozi is that it covers practically the entire gradient of fire, from where fire is almost not at all important as a consumer in the system to where it's at its maximum. And it's really also interesting to note that it covers this region where fire sort of takes over from grazing and herbivory as the important dominant consumer. And you can see that when you look spatially in the park, you get a huge range of fire from areas that haven't really burnt. They've burnt maybe 1 to 4 times in the last 60 years, to areas that burn every year or every 2 years. But what's also important to note is that while rainfall is a key driver, as I've shown up here, in terms of how much fire you get in a system, because that accumulates the biomass and it's the grass that burns, this map, which is of fire, and this map, which is of rainfall, don't exactly coincide with each other. So it's not only rainfall that's describing what sort of fire you get. If you look at the vegetation, a lot of the areas that burn very often are not burning because they're thicket or forest. So vegetation also affects how much fire you get. And down here you can see the effect of humans, and you get lots of fires coming in from outside, and then they hit a fire break, they hit a road, and you don't get more fires. So the environmental controls of fire are quite varied and complex. And when you're talking about fire management, you have to see it within that context. So climate and weather and vegetation and other human activities all influence the fire regime. And fire management needs to understand this and to work sort of within abiotic and environmental constraints. And if it doesn't, then fire management is a very frustrating and ineffective enterprise. So just to illustrate this with an example from Kruger, this is some data looking at the cause of fires over the season during this period of lightning management in the 1990s, where actually what the park was aiming to do was to only allow lightning fires to burn. And as you can see, lightning fires, the orange ones, there are very few of them. Most of the fires in the park were arson fires, because there was very few management fires, because they weren't trying to put in controlled burning. So they were trying to achieve a fire management that was totally impossible given the type of conditions they had and the amount of people and the fact that the fuels were there. The fuels were going to burn. Whether it was a controlled burn or an arson burn was the question, but it was basically the park was going to burn. And this is a very different pattern. I mean, so it's not that we're totally powerless. We can affect how fire works, and we can use fire as a management tool. And to illustrate this, I just want to show you how it looks in Kruger. It's looked in the last decade, where they've had proactive fire management. They've been trying to put in burns early in the season to sort of create patchy burns and break up the landscape. And you can see there's a whole lot more management burns, so they have been applying fires, a whole lot less arson, but the lightning is still pretty much the same. So you can see that people can, like management can affect fire regime, but the most thing that we can impact is the season of burning and also the time of day or the weather conditions. But that means we can affect fire intensity and fire size, and those are really important ones if we're looking at managing our ecosystems. This is some data from Umfolozi Park, and you can see there's been a lot of controlled burning in the park over time in the last 50 years that we've had fire data. There's also been hardly any lightning. Those are these little orange dots. I think there are 10 records of lightning fires in the entire 60-year data set. But in contrast to Kruger, this is data from Berry McDonald. I haven't managed to analyze it, but I think we're going to show the same pattern. They analyzed the same data in the 1980s. Most of the control fires are put in August and September, and all the arson fires occur all throughout the season. So in Zululand Park, while there's the potential to use controlled burning to do a whole lot of different things and burn at different times of year, the managers don't seem to be doing that. They're just putting in fires in August and September. So let's look a little bit at the history of fire management in the park. Pre-proclamation, everyone assumes that there were quite frequent fires. Wherever there was dry fuel, it would burn, because there were many people around lighting. It wasn't an ignition-limited system. And in the early days, the records show that rangers lit fires when appropriate, and when appropriate probably means when there was dry grass to burn, because when people see dry grass, they just want to throw a match in. During the 10 years when the Harris fire traps were up, they tried to suppress fire, not for any ecological reasons, but just so as not to burn the fly traps down. Whether this was successful or not is also a wonder, because there's some aerial photos from the mid-30s which show lots of fires in the park. And then after that, there was quite haphazard application, but it was always like for a certain reason, like people were burned to attract game or to prevent bush growth. Bush encroachment was an issue in HiP. Back in the 1930s already, people were using fire to try to control bush encroachment. So there were lots of reasons why people applied fires, but they weren't necessarily very ecological. The sort of ecological kind of attitude arrived in 1955 with the influence of C.J. Ward, who also started mapping fires. And I just think it's great that we've got this 60-year data set of fires. And quite telling when you think that we've only had temperature data for Zululand Park for the last couple of years, whereas we have 60 years of fire data. It just goes to show what people are really aware of fire as an important driver in this system. So the ecological sort of perspective came in the 1950s and was around all the way through the 80s and 90s, but it was often contested. And you sort of had the ecologists with one paradigm, and you had the people from more agricultural backgrounds with another paradigm. So there was a lot of discussion, but no clear fire management plan. That really only became formalized in the last couple of years. And I'm going to discuss that, the more recent aspects, just now. But I just want to compare that history to the history of Kruger, which also has a long history of fire management. And you can see in Kruger, at the beginning, they were also sort of trying to achieve a management objective, often to promote grazing. But then they went through all sorts of strange periods where they tried to exclude fire. They had prescribed block burning. Then they had flexible prescribed burning, but still burning blocks, but without any particular ecological sort of management goal in mind. Then, of course, they had their lightning fires, and now they're sort of doing patch mosaic burning. In contrast to that, Hlefuru, I feel, has always had a much more kind of hands-on approach to fire. It's usually been applied to achieve a certain management goal. Except for the period of fire exclusion, that's really been the goal of applying fires. But the management goal, the particular management goal, has changed over time. So people have always been quite hands-on with fire in Zululand Park, which has made it a great place to discuss and to have interactions between scientists and managers. But the reasons for applying fire have changed and been quite varied over time. So they could range from protecting fire-sensitive plants, in which case people want to put in cool fires, to maintaining open grassy systems, so knocking back bush encroachment, in which case people want to put in hot fires. Then there's the idea of promoting grazing, creating green flush for animals at a key time of year when they're needing food, or promoting grazing by not burning, because then you've got a grazing reserve in case you have a dry year. So there's a lot of discussion around grazing. I'm going to come back to that. Then there's the idea of promoting grazing by maintaining tall grass communities, tourist visibility, and hunting. Those have been the most reasons why people have burned. And I had a bit of discussion about this with Dave Balfour. These are some quotes from my discussion. He basically said in the last sort of 30 years or so, it hasn't been well formalized, and it has often been contested between managers and also between managers and scientists. And as he also brought up the fact you've had ecological viewpoints and agricultural viewpoints. But he also said that ultimately it was the managers who did the burning, so their view generally held, even though there has actually been a lot of discussion. 5 minutes? I'm going to have to skip through all the science, I'm afraid. But irrespective of what burning regime was implemented, the underlying objective was either to control bush encroachment or to promote grazing. There's been these sort of two contradictory goals. So now I'm going to zip through the science. I want to discuss a little bit what sort of ecological basis and what the science has done to improve and give us ideas about fire management. So I want to discuss tree-grass interactions, and here's a slide from William Bond, where they've managed to quantify, this is a picture of some acacia karus trying to grow up out of the grass layer. They've quantified what intensity of fire you need to knock back a tree of a different height, and then they've quantified what fuel load you need to achieve that intensity. So while in the 1930s people already knew that you could burn to knock back encroaching woody shrubs, we've now got data that will tell you exactly how you must burn in order to achieve certain management goals. And we've developed that into models and related the models to different key species. So this is time since fire, and this is how tall the tree gets. So we know that you'd have to burn every 5 years to knock back acacia karoo, but only every 10 years to knock back acacia tortilus. So we've got some clear messages when it comes to tree-grass interactions. If you want to keep your systems open, you need to burn intense fires, and that means either high biomass or very late dry season when the weather's really hot and dry, and you need to burn often. So we've got some clear messages there, and it's backed up with really good data. When it comes to firestorms, things are still a bit contested, as Mariska pointed out. But it is true that mostly in these systems, only the grassy bits burn, and usually the forests are pretty safe. And this is some data that I produced to show that as tree cover increases, suddenly, boom, fire drops out, because trees don't generally burn. It's the grass that gets dry. However, this is another map of this firestorm, and you can see that over some of the area that it burned, it was doing exactly what a grassland fire is supposed to do, and it sort of filtered between all the forest patches. But at some point, when either the weather conditions got hot, or perhaps there was like extra fuels around in these forest areas, it turned into a crown fire regime, which is a very different thing. Now, is this desirable? It really depends on what's being burned. If you're burning back encroaching thicket, then it's a great idea. If you're burning scalp forest, it's not such a good idea. But we're having a bit of a sense of under what conditions you get crown fire regimes in these grassy systems. So the message here is not quite as clear, but basically if you want to protect indigenous forest, you need to burn during moderate weather. And if you're wanting to transform thicket into open grassy systems, you should burn during extreme weather and try to create these crown fire events in a grassy system. And then the third issue that ecological ideas have fed into is in terms of fire-grazer interactions. Now we know pretty much that more grazers equals less fire, because if grazers eat the grass, then the fire can't eat the grass. This is a picture from Satara in the Kruger Park. Fire just went out after a few minutes because there wasn't any grass there. And we've got theoretical models that show that as your tall grass drops off, the proportion of area burned drops off. And we've got data from HiP that shows as well, as your tall grass drops off, you don't get any more fire. So that's pretty clear, and we've got data showing it more generally, that as you increase the number of grazers in the system, the number of fires drops. So you've got this negative relationship between grazers and fire. And Matt Waldron showed it beautifully. In areas where they took out white rhinos, boom, you suddenly got twice as much area burned. So we've got good understanding about how grazing affects fires. But what we know less about is the fire impact on grazing. And that's kind of come through in all these different ideas about how we should burn in order to promote grazing. You could burn, but what fire does is it provides new green forage. So that's positive in the short term. But it removes the grazing reserve, so it removes whatever vegetation you've got there. So it's potentially negative in the medium term if you're going into a drought. You've basically got rid of all the grass that the animals could have been eating during the drought. Fire generally promotes these sort of tussock grasses, which are tall and generally not very palatable. So agriculturally it's considered good, but there's arguments about how useful that is. And the other key thing that we've been focusing on in HiP is the fact that fire tends to spread animals out in the system and disperse them. So wherever they were grazing before, once you've had a fire, they go everywhere, because everywhere is suddenly palatable. So it moves them off the heavily utilized sites. And we're arguing that potentially that's negative in the long term, because you're getting rid of the heterogeneity that's created by grazing. This is an example of a little incipient, heavily utilized site, short grazed, palatable, grazing tolerant grasses, surrounded by a tall matrix of tall grass. If you burn frequently, then that intensively grazed site is going to disappear, because the animals won't be focusing on it. They'll be eating all of the delicious new regrowth all around. And we've got some, I'm not going to show you that data, but here's some data showing how it's got a negative relationship between fire and these lawn grass patches. So what message are we going to get out? The fire impact on grazing is complex. Have we got a message to tell the managers about how they should be burning when it comes to grazing? Ultimately, when it comes to this approach that Hluri has of like using fire as a tool, it's complex because different objectives require different fire regimes. We want early season fires to protect fire-sensitive communities. We want late fires to knock back woody saplings. We want frequent fires to knock back woody saplings. We want small area burns or infrequent fires to promote heterogeneity in grazing lawn habitat. Now, some people have just said, well, let's just burn a whole range of different fires, and we'll assume that if we have a diverse suite of fires, we've got biodiversity, we can assume everything will be fine. That doesn't seem to be the way that HiP is going. Current fire management policy does say that it wants to have a shifting mosaic of different fire impact and size, but it doesn't give any indication about how to do that. And actually, the last time they had a meeting was in 2009, and it was a lot more directed because people are quite hands-on in Hluri. They mapped the park in terms of what management objective they want, and they associated each management objective with a fire regime. So if they wanted to maintain grassland, then they would say we want to burn like this. If they wanted to maintain woodland, we need to burn like this. And these were the 5 different sort of states that they were looking to manage. And this micromanagement seemed to be a bit fuzzy, but it was related to having heterogeneous lawn grass patches. But they didn't really look at grazing because it was all about structure, vegetation structure, because that's a lot easier to handle. So this is just an example in the north. They mapped the whole park saying this is what we want to achieve and this is the fires that we're going to put in, which is pretty exciting. Have they managed to do that? Well, you can see that each section of the park, this is trends over time in terms of how frequent fire has been, and this is thanks to Joris. You can see each section has shown very different trends over time, and we're getting a great increase in fire in the north and a bit of a decrease in the south. Now, whether this increase is due to the managers going away from that meeting in 2009 saying, I'm going to put in frequent intense fires and knock back the bush encroachment, or whether it's because we've had a couple of good rainfall years, or whether it's because there was some chromalina there that needed to be burned, is not clear, and we're still trying to unpack that. So the role that management has had in these trends over time is still not clear. So our current fire management policy appears to be pretty applied, but in focusing on particular management objectives, you tend to forget about other objectives, and in particular burning for grazing has not been as dominant as it was in the past. When I was in the park, everyone was worried about burning to promote grazing. Now I have to stop. So, Hluri has avoided some of the pitfalls of fire suppression and block burning that other parks have got into. And there's clear understanding of fire as an ecosystem engineer and a management tool. We've got some really, science and management has really done well on this, and we've got an ecological basis for our fire management. When it comes to grazing, there's still no clarity from the ecologists about what actually should be going on. And I just think, that's something we should maybe be considering. There's a drop in grazer numbers at the moment. We've had 10 years of good rain, I think, but apparently that's also contested. So no one's worried about the grazing reserve. Like 90% of the park burns every year. But if we go into a drought this year, no one's really thought about what's going to happen. So there's sort of a challenge to ecologists to provide sensible guidelines. Thank you, and I'm sorry for running over time.